Mr. Wolf, first of all, welcome to our show. I'm delighted that you are here today. And interesting fact, we could have been fellow countrymen because your mom is from Amsterdam, right?
That is correct. She was born in 1918 in Amsterdam. She came to Britain with her family, immediate family, during the Second World War. But I couldn't have been Dutch. In fact, I only exist because of the Second World War, as is true of many people, I think, because my mother met my father, who was a refugee from Vienna in Britain during the war, and it is inconceivable that they would have met in any other circumstances, so there would be no me, completely different children for both of them.
Right. Your grandfather naturally was Jewish, and he was in an early stage well aware of the threat of the Nazis. And he got a boat from IJmuiden. What's the story there?
Well, my grandfather, who left school, I think at 11 or perhaps even younger, became a merchant, a trader from the very beginning. He was one of 9, very large Jewish Amsterdam, very poor families, and he became a fish merchant. In the 20s, he thought, whatever bad things are, people will always want to eat fish. Very shrewd. So in the 20s and 30s, difficult years, he was a fish merchant in IJmuiden. His firm, Wijnschenk, was his name. And as soon as the Germans invaded, he realized the threat. Fortunately, he'd left money in Britain. He did a lot of trade with Birdseye, which was part of Unilever. And he managed to get hold of a trawler. The story is he hijacked it at gunpoint. I don't know whether that's true, but he got a trawler. He invited all his wider family to come, not just his immediate family. None of the others came. They were all killed, without exception. But his family, his daughter, his 5 children, his wife and a nanny got to England, and that's where they remained during the war. And everybody else, except my mother, went back to Holland after the war, and that's where they still live.
Yeah, I'm asking you this because we in the Netherlands commemorate this week the liberation of the Nazis. And traditionally, we celebrate this in Amsterdam. The king gave a speech in which he stated, Willem-Alexander, that we didn't pay a lot of attention to the fate of the Jews, like your family. And I quote the speech of the king. He said, "Fellow citizens in need felt abandoned, not heard enough, insufficiently supported, if only in words. Also from London, also by my great-grandmother, yet steadfast and fierce in her resistance, it is something that will not let me go." What is your take on this?
Well, I think it is very appropriate that the Dutch government and the king, whom I've met and like, recognize what happened during the war. Clearly, the Dutch bureaucracy cooperated pretty actively on the whole with the Nazis, and an enormous proportion of Dutch Jews were killed. On the other hand, I also recognize the Netherlands was conquered. It was completely under control of the Nazis. It wasn't very easy to do anything about it. Ultimately, the Dutch were not responsible for this catastrophe. But the destruction of the Dutch Jewish population, of which I'm a product ultimately, was, I think, a genuine historical catastrophe. And of course, in my view, also a catastrophe for the Netherlands.
Yes. I'm asking you all this because in your column in the Financial Times, you are comparing the 30s of the last century and the Great Depression and everything that led up to the regime of Adolf Hitler to what is happening now, the coronacrisis, and maybe a rehearsal of the Great Depression. How worried are you?
Well, there are 2 things that are worth remembering. One is that we've just had an enormous financial crisis only 10 or so years ago, and many economies in the West have never fully recovered, and very much in Europe. So there's a lot of anxiety and anger. They haven't recovered, even if they recovered in employment, they haven't recovered in growth, in prosperity. All the major Western countries, with very few exceptions, are much poorer now than we expected them to be in the early 2000s. And now comes this new shock. And right now, governments really are struggling to handle it. And we are, I think, at this moment, experiencing the steepest decline in output across probably the world, certainly the world, but even more across the advanced countries that has ever occurred. Now, we hope it won't be like the 30s. It will be stopped. We will recover. We will manage the disease. And in 2 or 3 years, we will be back to sort of normal. But it's becoming obvious this is a huge economic crisis as well as, of course, a health crisis.
Worst case scenario, what could go wrong?
Well, the worst case scenario, I suppose, has 2 big elements. One, we really don't get hold of the disease. We have recurrent waves of explosion of cases and deaths. Please God, no. And the governments are forced, or the people voluntarily, essentially, to what we now call adopt social distancing, which shatters the economy. And so we have periodic cycles, perhaps 2 or 3 between now and 2022, when the economy is really badly damaged. We never reopen trade properly. We don't open movement of people across frontiers properly. And the economy then is really badly damaged with colossal unemployment rates in many countries. Just look what is happening in the United States at the moment. Then that will lead to immense political anger and perhaps the election or re-election of right-wing populists. And that leads me to the second huge danger, is that will destroy international integration, international cooperation. We already see the burgeoning conflict between the US and China over who's to blame. And the world's order is shattered. And I'm even beginning to wonder whether the European order will survive. I've been focusing very much recently on the German Constitutional Court's ruling on the ECB actions, which seems to me quite fundamental. So I'm concerned that, as happened in the 30s, the economics and the health here together basically destabilize our political orders domestically and internationally. And these are very fragile orders. Yes. Democracy is very fragile, as we experienced in the 30s.
Since you are talking about the fragile system that we live in, for example, the European Union, in that sense, what do you make of the Dutch Minister of Finance, Wopke Hoekstra, who didn't want to give a generous aid package to Italy, that is a very hard-hit country in Europe?
Well, I think that there are 2 aspects of this. There's the reality and the symbolism. I never really believed that the governments of the Eurozone would agree to a really massive fiscal solidarity. I think it would be sensible, but that clearly requires constitutional changes of some kind. But emotions matter here. The gestures of solidarity matter here. Italy was not responsible for this virus. It has hit it incredibly hard. Its economy is hit very hard. I think the way you talk about one another, the indication you care about one another is incredibly important. And the Italians already feel abandoned in the great financial crisis and even more over immigration. So I think other leaders of other countries, serious countries like the Netherlands, should be very, very careful about how they talk, and they should be very clear that they do feel responsible for one another. That seems to me the core of the European ideal.
Who is going to pick up the bill for all the costs, the billions that are being given to people, to companies? Who will pay for this? The top rich 1%? Or the people with the low incomes?
Yeah, very good question. Well, I'm modestly optimistic. Nothing about the future is certain. That real interest rates will remain very low. If we can get back to growth in a couple of years' time, we will probably find that the real interest rate will be below the real growth rate, in which case we can hold much higher debt levels than most people assume. So nobody would actually have to repay the debt. We would have to grow out of it over a long period. That's what happened before. It is possible. However, we will come out of this with, I think, also huge deficits. Our economies will be smaller than we thought, so taxes will be tax revenue will be less. So the governments will have to raise taxes or cut spending. I don't think many of our countries can go through another bout of austerity as happened after the last financial crisis. So my assumption is taxes will rise on the relatively well-off, who have on the whole been relatively shielded in this crisis. They're the people who can work at home, they're the people who have good pensions. So my view is, if one is relatively well-off, as I am, I do expect to pay more, and I think that's part of the social bargain.
Yes. As you said, you know the Dutch king, Willem-Alexander. You are attending sometimes the Bilderberg conference. You talk to the directors of the central banks in the world, to political leaders. How worried is this establishment about what is happening right now? Are they still in control, or should we expect social unrest?
I think they are, and they should be, really frightened. Because this is unprecedented and completely unexpected. I mean, not unexpected in the sense nobody thought a pandemic could happen, but nobody thought it's going to happen now. And that's shown in the way they responded. Policymakers have done a pretty good job in responding to the immediate crisis. Surprisingly good, particularly the economic policymakers. But they know this is very early days. They have an enormous number of problems to get through, staggering number of problems, which I've discussed. And I don't think any of them is confident that they're going to get through this really easily. But some countries have done better than others, and we must follow those examples.
Yes. Last question, Mr. Wolf. Since you're part of this Jewish community and your family history started here in Amsterdam, and your parents and your grandfather had to get rid out of this country to London, how worried are you for the future, and especially the democratic rule, the rule of law in Europe?
Well, I'm not worried about the Netherlands. I hope I'm right not to be worried. I think there are a lot of European countries where things are very stable. But countries in Central and Eastern Europe, whose experience of democracy is more recent, and I think there's a real wave of right-wing populism in Italy and even possibly in France. I don't want to go into countries. And if this crisis ends up terribly and the establishments are discredited completely, then I think we will never be confident that the political order will be stable. That's why it's so important to get a hold of it and to deal with it together.
Martin Wolf, thanks a million for your time today. Thank you very much.
A great pleasure.